Hello. How you guys doing? Good. You guys are awake. You're all around me. You're surrounded. I'm surrounded, which is good. I am wearing pants. Have no fear. Most of you seem to be wearing pants as well, as best I can tell. Very good. So I have an unusual story to tell you about an unusual book. So as a writer, I'm a writer. I make a living writing books. This is my 5th book, and I'm a critic of other writers, as most writers are. I think that we have a problem with expertise and punditry right now, that it's very easy for people who maybe used to do something years and years ago and became famous for giving advice or being experts about things, arrogantly give advice and write books about the 5 ways to be more innovative or the 10 ways to do this. And they give a lot of prescriptive advice about things that they probably haven't done in a very long time. And I think that's a problem. And as someone who's made a living for the last decade as an author, I've been afraid that I have become victim to the same thing. And so I've been looking for an opportunity to go back into a real job. Of course, writing is very difficult and very real, but it's not real in the same sense of actually having to manage a team of people and make a product and try to make revenue and all of those sorts of challenging tasks. That I thought that at some point I should go back and see how much of what I had written in other books and advice I had given to other people that I actually practice. And so that's the story behind this book, The Year Without Pants. I spent a year working for WordPress.com, and I'll tell you more about WordPress and about what I did there, but this is an unusual story to tell because the book is not structured around the 10 tactics or the 10 tips or the 5 tricks. Instead, what I wanted to do with the book was to actually honestly document what it's like to be a manager at a new company on a new team in a culture that is still figuring out what it is. I don't know of any book that has done that. There are many books that you read that profile companies, and there have been many books about Google that I'm sure you have read, but those books are typically written by outsiders. They're typically written by journalists, people who are not engineers, people who are not veterans of startup companies or making products, and often they have to trade their sharper words or their more critical thoughts to get access to write the book in the first place. So this opportunity was unusual in that I had no restrictions on what I could write about. And the story as to how I got hired is also very interesting. So before I started this career as a writer, I worked for about a decade, 9 years, at a little company called Microsoft. And I worked on a product called Internet Explorer. I worked on Internet Explorer 1. And I worked there for about 9 years, and then I left to write books. And one of those books happened to be read by the founder of WordPress, a guy named Matt Mullenweg, who started WordPress, the open source blogging platform project, in 2003. So he and I knew each other. We'd exchange email here and there. Every now and then he might ask me for a little bit of advice about project management or managing teams of people. And then at some point he decided that the company, which up until 2009 had been completely flat, so of the 50 employees there, they all reported directly to him. All the developers and designers, a completely flat company. They started to recognize that there were limitations to that and that maybe they needed to try something else. And what they're going to try was this radical, crazy idea called teams. Form into teams. But they had never done this before. They weren't sure what to do. And part of Matt Mullenweg's mad genius notion for how to figure out how to do this would be to form the company into about 10 teams and to pick one person from outside the company to manage one of those teams. And that person was me. So I was hired to be one of the first team leads at the company and to help them try to figure out how to change their culture and how to make a slightly more structured environment work at the company at all. So that's my story. And if you choose to tweet or broadcast anything I'm saying, that's great. My handle is Birkin, and the hashtag for any discussions of the book while I am on this tour is #NoPants, which I think is really cool. One of the pleasures of being an author and choosing names for books is if you pick the right name, you get to come up with crazy little hashtags and other jokes. So I take great pleasure in that, and I hope that you do as well. So let me tell you a little bit about WordPress. How many of you have heard of WordPress? Just sanity check. How many of you, I shouldn't ask the second question. I won't ask that question. So WordPress has had enormous success in part because of its open source roots. Currently, there's about 70 million websites that run on WordPress. It's about 1 in 5 of all blogs and websites in the world are powered by WordPress. WordPress.com, which is where I worked, is actually a corporate entity that runs WordPress in a hosted format. WordPress, the software, is free. WordPress.com is where you go to get free hosting as well. WordPress.com recently passed Yahoo to be the 8th most popular trafficked website in the United States. So WordPress.com is amazingly successful, and it's continuing to grow. It gets about 4 billion page views a month, just to give you guys a sense of scale. I know you guys all know about these sorts of numbers and metrics and how that compares to other popular web properties. So a lot of the interesting things and bizarre things I'm going to tell you about how WordPress.com worked and the experiment and how it went of me working there, that there are a lot of startups and small entrepreneurial companies that do crazy, wacky things, and it's very popular for Fast Company or Newsweek magazine to write stories about these cute little startups that have crazy ways of working. But I offer you these statistics not to impress you about WordPress or anything, but just to represent the fact that this is not some jokey, cute little startup that has nothing to lose, that the company has been in existence since 2005. So this is a stable business that's worked for a long time. And the fact that they're continuing to experiment and try new things, I think, is admirable, at least admirable. So this is the rundown of all of the unusual things that I had to try to figure out how to navigate. So the first is that no one there uses email. No one uses email. Now, everyone gets an email account. There's not some mandate that says, thou shalt not send email. But everyone has an email account, but almost no one uses it. So in the year and a half that I worked at WordPress.com, 90% or so of all the email that I sent or received was with people outside the company, other partners or other customers that I had to work with. And that's kind of mind-blowing if you think about it. You guys probably spend a lot of your time in Gmail. You spend a lot of your time sending mail and reviewing mail and all that. Most of the modern workforce does. And they completely work in a different way. I'll talk more about specifically how they do that in a second. Second, everyone works remotely. And that's one meaning of the title, The Year Without Pants. So the entire company, there's now about 200 employees that work there. I was hired as employee number 58 or so. So the book covers the time when the company was about 55 people to about 120. But from the origins of the company, everyone worked remotely. So it's built into the culture that every new hire, it's assumed you will work from anywhere on the planet you wish. It does not matter. Nobody cares. So the company is naturally very diverse, geographically and in terms of time zones. There's people working in every time zone. So at any time, no matter where you are in the world or what time zone you're in, you can log into the chat room and you'll find other people who are actually working at the same time as you somewhere else. There are very few rules, obviously. The fact that there's remote work by default eliminates a lot of the normal structure and process and procedure. Even if you wanted to be very micromanagey, it'd be hard to do, simply because you don't have control or even predictability about when people are going to be online and where they're going to be working from. They use what's called, the fancy word for it is continuous deployment. So another reason why they're able to get away with so much autonomy is that WordPress.com is a live service, and they have very few restrictions about how features launch. So if you're a designer or a developer, there's not some review board for how do you pitch ideas for features or how you decide what bugs you're going to fix this week. It's very self-directed and autonomous, which means that there's never large dependencies between code bases. There's very rarely a huge schedule that's going to block some work from being done, which eliminates a lot of the normal politics you have in most workplaces. So I'm going to talk to you for another 10 or 15 minutes about how some of this stuff worked and what my experience was like. But since you guys have a fascinating culture as well, you guys are on the cooler end and more liberal end and future thinking end about how workplaces should work. I know that. So I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes just about to give you more of this story, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions. So you should start thinking now about what specific things you hoped I would talk about. And if I don't cover that in the next 10 minutes, that's what the microphones will be for. Cool? Not that you guys really have a choice in the matter, but that's how we're going to roll. So, one reason why this project was fascinating for me as a writer, most of the books I've written took about a year to write, research and everything included. This project took me 3 years, and I had to actually go and work at a company for a year and a half in order to actually do the stuff that would be in the book. So this was a real big investment of time and energy. And one of the main reasons I was interested in this is I think that there's fundamental problems with the workplace, with the modern workplace, with the knowledge workplace. I think there are things that are broken. And it's not that hard to find evidence of this, to find data that supports that argument. There was a recent study by Gallup, the Gallup polling agency, of American workers. This was done, I think, last year. And the study was focused on engagement, which is an unusual thing to try and measure. Engagement was a self-reported evaluation of how engaged people were with their job, how engaged they were. And about 70% of the people who responded to this survey and participated said they were not engaged at work. About 30% of that number said they were actively disengaged. Actively disengaged. That means you're not even faking being interested in what you're doing. That's what that means. That means you're like a brain surgeon and you're operating, you got a scalpel in one hand and the other hand you're playing Angry Birds or something. That's what actively disengaged. That's about a third of the workforce. And if you think about the experiences you have in life with people who you know, who work at other places, people you're experiencing in your daily life at the coffee shop or at the insurance agency, it shows. We all have these experiences with people where they are clearly not interested in what they're doing. Now, I know from my own experience, I've had a fair number of lousy jobs in my life. I've done telemarketing, I've been a waiter, I've done all sorts of odd jobs just to make it through college and whatnot. And I know that some of those jobs, I was engaged. Not all of them, but some of them I were. And it depended on who I was working with and who I was working for. So I look at this number as an indictment of management, as a discipline. That this means there's something fundamentally broken about the basic notion of how managers function and how they evaluate their own work. And so I was interested in going to work at WordPress.com for a bunch of reasons. First, it was a culture that had no managers. Up until the point I was hired, there was no such thing. And they were experimenting with introducing a layer of management, which is an unusual situation to observe, much less participate in. And second, having had previous experience as a manager, most of my career at Microsoft was spent as a team leader kind of guy, I was interested to see what I could do to bring the good parts of what good managers do and see if I could possibly use that in a valuable way inside the culture. So that's the story of the book. The book follows my year of trying to, hey, do any of these things I have in my toolkit actually matter anymore? Do they work? And the book follows me experimenting and trying things out and failing in many cases, succeeding in others, and eventually arriving at some conclusions about how the function of management in these non-traditional, more employee-centered environments. There's good reasons why management is so flawed. The primary one being that the origins of management as a profession come from the industrial age. And it was the robber baron era of the industrial age that funded most of the major business schools, at least in America. Not all of them, but many of them. Vanderbilt, the oil barons, Rockefeller, these are the people who funded most of the major business schools that we have. And those industries, banking, oil, railroads, most of the work that needed to be done was industrial age work. So the central point of what was thought to be creative work was done by management. So it's no surprise that people who come from MBA schools are largely trained that executives are the most important and central visionary force in any organization. And that may be true if you are managing people who are doing repetitive work, who are in a factory and they are basically applying Taylor's time and motion studies to how many widgets they can make per minute or per hour. You could argue that maybe that stuff makes sense there. But as we have moved into this knowledge age where most people are making things, could be writing code or designing software or writing blog posts, or it could be making documents or spreadsheets. But when people are making things, that centricity on executives, I think, is dubious. That's rarely where the most important visionary work is going to happen anymore. And there's a lot of evidence and support for the theory that innovation and progress always happens on the margins. It happens on the people who have the least at stake. So this notion that we've inherited about what managers do and how they work, I think, is flawed, and I wanted to investigate that. The other interesting question, it's probably the most popular thing that WordPress.com, and Automattic is the name of the company that runs WordPress.com, is this notion of remote work. It's the question that comes up the most. Right now, about 20% of all people who work in professional jobs work remotely. And that number has been climbing and will probably continue to climb. So right now, it's about 1 in 5. And if you consider the number of companies that have liberal remote work policies, where you're allowed to work from home 1 day a week or a few days a month, the number's even larger. And I think as tools get better and better, and there's more things where the work is done primarily through computers, I think this number will continue to climb. There's lots of workplaces that I've been talking about the book now. It's been out for just a few weeks, but I'm on book tour right now, so I go to lots of places like you guys and I talk about the book. And there's lots of companies who are just very freaked out by this remote work notion. And I am actually not a super zealot about it. I don't think everyone should work remotely. But I think the questions that it raises are really good about why should you care about where people are. You should care about how productive they are. And if they can be productive on a Jeep on safari in Africa that happens to have good Wi-Fi, and the code they check in and the writing they do or whatever their job is good, why should you care? If their coworkers are happy with the collaboration that's going on, why does it matter? So a lot of these places where people get these very defensive responses about remote work, I usually ask them a simple question. What percentage of your time in an office is spent working with your coworkers purely through a computer? And they think about it, and it's high. 50%, 60%, it's really high. And I'm thinking email, anything you do through a web browser, could be a chat room, it could be a message board, Skype, or even on the telephone, which is really one of the first kinds of remote work we've ever had. It's high. So if your work is mostly mediated through a computer, your location is irrelevant. Does not matter. For the 30 or 40% of the time that you actually need to be at a whiteboard together or at a meeting together, fine. But for the majority of your time, if it's spent through computers, which most workplaces are, this number should not be that surprising. You're already doing remote work. If you ever had the experience where you're in a conference room where one person is talking and the other 12 people in the room are staring at their laptop, who here has had that happen? Most of you, right? What is going on there? You have one person talking, 12 people on their laptops doing something else that could be entirely done remotely. Anyway, so that's the other big question that comes up, 20%, that number's on the rise. So I had all these questions coming into taking on this project. One was personal about my own figuring out my relevance as an expert and wanting to challenge myself to see how much I practiced. Then there's all these other questions that come up. What other work conventions do we have today, even in successful workplaces, that make no sense or have no data to support them? Working 9 to 5 is one. I've yet to see a study that says working 9 to 5 makes you more productive. There's lots of evidence to say that it doesn't, because usually that means a commute. So that means 35 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour a day is spent in frustration, spent sacrificing time just to get to a place where you're going to stare at a screen. I wanted to ask that question. Then there are other ones too about dress codes. I'm talking to you guys in the software industry, and I can tell by looking at you. You guys are well dressed, but we're in the software industry here. Dress code is not really an important problem anymore. But for most of the working world, that's not true. Dress codes are still something that is mandated in most workplaces. Then other things like hierarchy in meetings, this question about email. I had all these big questions I wanted to try and answer. So I'm going to give you some of those answers, and then I'll open the floor for questions. So this picture is my team when I was hired. So this was taken in September of 2010. And when I was hired, my team was small. We had 3 developers, and we were all in the same place. What's interesting, of course, we're all in the same place, and what are we doing? We're staring at screens. And on these screens, we're actually chatting with each other. This is a common occurrence. I'm sure it's been a common occurrence for you guys as well. What's unusual about this photo, and what you can't tell from the photo, is it looks like we're in some kind of dumpy apartment with bad lighting. We were not in a dumpy apartment with bad lighting. We were in a dumpy hotel dumpy hotel lobby with bad lighting. And we happened to be in Athens, Greece. The reason why we're in Athens, Greece is very simple. The people in this room, all these guys who worked on my team, were all from different parts of the world. So Mike Adams on the left was from California, Andy Peatling in the middle was from Ireland, and Bo Levens on the right was from Australia. And the company supported the notion that periodically every team should get together to be face-to-face to capture all the intangibles that you can't get remotely. So even for a company that's 100% distributed and is a poster child for remote work, there's this belief from the founders of the company, periodically you need to refresh all these little things you get only when you're together. Having the team newly formed, no one had done one of these meetups before, so we decided to go and try to figure out how these things would even work. And this is that photo. Now, the challenge I had with this team of developers, so I'm actually not a developer. I have a background in computer science. I knew halfway through my computer science degree that I would never be a good developer, so I tried to find something else to do. I learned about UI design and project management, and that's what allowed me to be a manager at Microsoft. I had enough of a technical background to collaborate and evaluate developers, but I've never really been one. So my role on the team, I didn't write a line of code. My job instead was a meta job of figuring out what does a lead mean in the structure in this company, and if I can figure out how to do that, can I teach other leads at the company to do the same thing? And this was a huge challenge. This was a terrifying challenge. How do I figure out how a team should work and add some kind of structure, because that's what a team is, into a young, very non-corporate, chaotic, developer-centric, autonomous culture? What is my approach going to be? What tricks am I going to employ? What tactics? Most of management literature is just methodologies where you just tell people what to do and put boxes around everything, and I knew none of that stuff would work. I didn't like any of that stuff anyway, but I knew none of it would work. So I thought really hard about this before I got hired to come up with I needed some kind of playbook. And the answer that I came up with was embarrassingly simple, that I needed to provide clarity and trust. Clarity and trust. It seems underwhelming. This was my grand strategy, just these two things. But I was convinced that part of why that 70% engagement number in the general workplace is so low is because managers fail to provide these two things. They fail to earn the trust of their employees, they fail to trust their employees as well, and they fail to provide clarity about how certain decisions are made. So this was my playbook and my approach. And when I was first hired, the first thing I did as a lead was nothing. I decided that in order to earn trust, I had to be patient and just listen. So for the first few weeks that we worked as a team, I didn't really do very much. I was basically the scribe. I was the scribe. It was the only tool I could use to earn trust. We'd have a conversation in IRC or on Skype, and I'd write up a summary, and I'd post it on our team blog, and I'd show that I reflected what I heard, I distilled it down, and little by little I showed that I was not a moron, and I'd been paying attention, and I could think well. As management goes, that's a good curve to get over. I'm sure you've had managers at your career where they didn't quite meet those bars. And then little by little, I converted from being the scribe to being someone who initiated conversations, and then initiated how we made decisions. And then eventually, I tried to work my way to having enough trust that I was effectively the leader of the team and helped decide the direction and decisions and which things we would do or not do. So the technology here, this is the thing people usually most want to know, is how did we actually work? What was a day like? What was a week like? How did you get around email? And there was 3 simple tools that we used for most of our communication. IRC, Internet Relay Chat, ancient program from like 1985, very popular in open source communities, which is why WordPress used it. 2 is Skype, and 3 was blogs. Also not a surprise, given that WordPress.com is a blogging company. Of course, you're going to use the thing that you think everyone should use. Those were the 3 tools. So 90% of our communication, my communication with the team and the company, were through these 3 tools. IRC, which is in the photo all the way on the left, is effectively the hallway. That's how I tried to map my outsider experience at WordPress.com. It's the hallway. It's where you go to interact with people you wouldn't normally meet. The whole company is usually there, whoever's working. You can go in there and talk to anyone about anything. If you have a question or some bug you're trying to fix or something you're trying to track down, you go in there, you ask a question, someone will invariably be, hey, yeah, sure, I'll help you take a look at that. It's also where you go to have social chats where something's going on in the news. You can go in there and have a conversation. It's the hallway. That's where the serendipity happens, and that's where meetings often happened, as much as there were meetings, which there were not very many of them. Skype was the equivalent of one-on-one conversations and communication. So all the interactions most of the interactions I had with my team would often be in Skype. Certainly any conversation I had with someone who's on my team, where it was manager-employee conversation, that was about performance or critique or feedback, that'd be done in Skype. And then blogs was the dominant medium for all team interaction. So all the stuff that often goes on in email, where there's long discussion threads about should we design it this way or that way, what about this? Most of that stuff was done on blogs. And instead of it being an email thread, it would be in a comment thread. The upside of this was that all of this stuff, certainly IRC and the blogs, are visible. It's transparent. So anyone at the company could go and read any of these things. Unlike email, it's all searchable and archival. Stuff lives on forever. Man, you don't have to do anything. You get all that for free. The downside was that all the stuff is public. All the stuff is visible to everybody. So I had some challenges. Some of the critique that I had of the culture of the company was that I found it was hard to get truly, brutally honest critiques of work, because people did not want to look mean in front of the whole company. It was also hard for people in some cases to be truly expressive of their opinions, because they knew this stuff would live on forever. And I can talk more about how I tried, at least on my own team, to overcome those challenges. Anyway, technologically speaking, this is the story. This explains the remote work process. It explains how we got away with not using email. And it should be maybe a mild surprise. These are all free tools. There's no magic here. It's not like there was some special video conferencing software that they used or invented. These are all cheap and fairly old tools, which I think is incredibly telling about many answers to questions about why certain workplaces function and why certain workplaces don't. That it's not about the management method, it's not about the technology, it's about the culture. The culture being the basic units of interaction and assumptions and protocols that people have naturally about how they interact with each other. So it turned out that at WordPress.com, I was shocked. One of the biggest shocks I had was everybody writes well. Everybody writes well. It was shocking. It was mind-blowing. I never would have thought that would be a secret, because every company in the world has the same rhetoric. We are excellent communicators. We, say we write clearly, and which most people don't. But that explains why there was so little need for structure, why these tools could be so lightweight, because the tools can never do the hard parts of having people have high reading comprehension, or people who are willing to write generously and carefully and thoughtfully. Every team had its own blog. There's a special theme, WordPress theme, that they use called P2, which solves many of the annoyances of blogs in terms of teamwork. So the P2 theme, which is a publicly available open source theme, works sort of like Twitter. You go to the P2 or the team blog. There's a box at the top. You can type in whatever it is that you're working on, and you hit post. So there's no dashboard or any other admin UI to deal with. And that allows for very quick, very fast, very lightweight updating and posting of things. And also, they were very personalized. So once the teams were formed, there was this question of whether teams would work at all. I think the P2s, the fact that every team had one, enabled some kinds of tribalism to start, where teams would start to embellish. We're all designers and developers. They start to embellish their team blogs, and that helped team cultures to develop on their own. So I'm going to wrap up and open the floor for questions in just a second. The story about my experience there, I think, is important, not because I advocate people copy everything that WordPress.com does, but the example and the questions that they ask, I think, are very important. about questioning the assumptions we have about how work is done, and also forcing the responsibility or making visible the responsibility that managers and executives have to experiment and be open to trying different ways of working. To be open to try different ways of working. Remote work just being one example of that. Any executive who tells me that they had a good performing employee who said, I want to try to work remotely, and they say, I would never let them do that, I think is an idiot. I think they're a fool. What do they have to lose by experimenting and let someone try working remotely? If they can actually work remotely and perform just as well, that's an advantage. You now have an employee that is really happy doing the same amount of work and will continue looking for ways to work better and smarter, which is what every executive and manager should want. And maybe it's not working remotely. Maybe it's trying to work with less email centricity. Or maybe it's trying to work where a different tool is used to communicate or to manage progress or whatever. There's so much resistance to even experimentation and trying. And I think that's the fundamental lesson I hope people get from reading the book and hearing the story of me experimenting and them experimenting by even having me come in as an employee. These numbers, I think, are going to get worse in terms of employment engagement. I also think the numbers of remote workers is going to go up. And those two trends alone makes WordPress.com an interesting example that I hope people study. So that's my talk. Thank you for listening so far. Thank you, Mr. First Clap guy. It's an important role. So I'll open the floor for questions. You guys came here. I am an open book, literally. So I will answer any question that you're brave enough to ask. Yeah.
So was it your experience that with this non-traditional workplace that 100% of your employees were engaged and productive? And if not, how did you deal with it?
I think that engagement was very high there. I couldn't give you a number because it wasn't the kind of place that did employee surveys and polls and whatnot. But certainly my team was very engaged. I had a really solid team. The company, because of its open source roots and because of how they hire, engagement is a different story. So I should tell you how they hire, because it's very unusual and really clever. They don't do interviews. Instead, and this will blow your mind, it's crazy, they hire you by trial. So if you make it through referrals and they decide that they want to possibly consider hiring you, you are given an actual project that needs to be done. And hey, here you go do it. Here's access to some of our IRC chat rooms, some of our blogs, some of our code base. You have access, go. We'll pay you a little bit of money, go build the thing. And that's a radical idea in the tech community, the business community. It's radical. Oh, it's too expensive, it's too painful. But then you think about how you hire people in your own life. Like if you were having a wedding and you wanted a cake, you wouldn't go to the baker and go, why don't you tell me about your strengths and weaknesses as a baker? Tell me about a baking project that went wrong and what you learned from it. Like you would never ever do that. You'd say, make me a cake. I'm hiring you to make cakes. Make me a cake. So they do the same thing. And because they're a tech company, most of the employees are either designers or developers or writers, people who make stuff. They say, okay, go make stuff. And that process eliminates many of the challenges that most workplaces do. Because a lot of the trial projects fail. Some people are not willing to put in the time. They already have a job. They don't want to do more work. To do a trial project, the trial projects are usually small, but it's going to take a couple of weekends. It's going to take some time. A lot of people who say they want to work there, they give up on the trial. So that's about engagement. How interested really are you in WordPress? How interested are you really in blogging? And maybe you think you are because you've heard about remote work or some other attribute of the company, but really, here's a project. And that trial project also helps with filtering people out who are not suited to be remote workers. Trial projects, there's no schedule. No one tells you how much of your trial project did you get done today, which is the same way the culture works. Even though there are teams now and I was a lead, it is very, very hands-off culture. It's assumed that because you are a developer or designer, you know how to manage your time. You know how to get stuff done. You have a basic ability to do time management. So people who fail at the trial project are probably people who wouldn't make good employees anyway. Other questions?
Perhaps you were a little too generous to the existing management paradigm. I mean, if you look at the auto companies that do well, there are places like the Japanese ones which get 2,000 pieces of advice from the floor each year and do a continuous improvement, get better engagement. Your comments?
Sure. There's, I think engagement is largely about respect. And there's lots of workplaces where employees know they're not respected. It's a very basic emotional anthropological principle. I don't think you need any sort of fancy management method to know that. It's about treating people like people. And when people are treated like people, they tend to behave better because they feel better about how meaningful the work they're doing is. So there's lots of, you can look at Toyota, which has a history of implementing a lot of these methods that U.S. auto companies have been trying to emulate or have emulated or copied or whatnot. But we're prone to copying the method and believing that there's something magical in the techniques. It's a very logical view of the world. But there's just something natural and human about being willing to treat people well. And that's part of the principles that I learned at WordPress.com about not just the platitude of it, but you're hired, you're smart, you're an adult. Why would we treat you in a way that pretended like you're a child, which is how most workplaces operate? Most restrictions that workplaces have, I think, are very parental. Oh, it would be bad for you if you did that, so we're not going to let you do that. And that's the logic that they use. And we are executives and managers, so therefore, we should be parenting. That's our job. If we are not creating rules and structures, what are we doing? There's a sort of nervous energy, I think, that managers have, that if they don't feel like they're active, they feel like there's something wrong. And therefore, that's a huge part of what leads to how much micromanagement there is. They believe that they have to be actively managing and controlling, which defeats the purpose of the organization itself. Yes, sir.
So WordPress is a company where almost everybody works remotely. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to make a company culture work where, say, most people are in an office and some people work remotely. Like, how do you get the people who are working remotely plugged into the conversation? Like, what additional things do they need to do, and
Sure.
people in the office need to do?
So that is a great point, that when you have a company that is 100% or mostly remote, some of the challenges are easier because everyone's remote. So there's no central office with a bunch of people who are remote workers. What that means, though, so during the year and a half that I worked there, we had every different flavor. That in some cases, we'd all be remote. That was the majority. Sometimes we'd all be together. Sometimes we'd have these meetups, but there'd be 2 or 3 of my team that couldn't make it. So I ended up with every different dynamic that I had to figure out. My answer is that there has to be someone, at least one person, who takes into account the how much is not made. I'm not going to, let me think this for a second. How much of what goes on in the office is not manifested at all digitally? Someone has to be thinking about that. Having had the experience or having thought about it, if I'm the only remote worker on a project, we have our meeting, on Google Hangout or whatever. We have our meeting, and when I'm in the meeting, I'm like, yeah, I'm engaged. I get what's going on. Then the next day, stuff happens, and what the hell's going on? And what happened is after that meeting or that evening, there was some other conversation in a hallway. People go, oh, we shouldn't do X, we should do Y. And they start doing Y. Meanwhile, I'm, 1,000 miles away thinking we're still doing X. So nobody thought about how this stuff has to be reflected so the other remote workers can see it. Now, usually what happens is if you're the sole remote worker, you end up becoming like Sherlock Holmes, where you're constantly investigating, you're doing like investigative journalism, you're trying to track down, hey, did you guys meet after? What happened? You're constantly in this mode of fear that there's stuff you need to know that you don't. So the solution is there has to be someone who's in the office, probably whoever the lead is, whoever has more accountability for the project, who's ensuring that that person does not have to be Sherlock Holmes, that they're getting advice and tips and insight into what they didn't capture because they're not in the same building, that stuff gets reflected. The easiest way to do that is if the manifestation of the project is digital. So we had this habit. So the P2, our blog, that was the repository for all of our conversations and all of our decisions. So even when two of us might meet, our team eventually was 8 or 9 people. If 2 of us happened to be in the same city at the same time, we did some work together at a whiteboard. As soon as we were done, we'd go and post on the blog. Hey, Fred and I just met for an hour. Here's what we just discussed and decided. So even though people weren't there, they at least understand something has changed and then go, Scott, how could you guys meet with that? Okay, and then we have a conversation about it. So the burden is on the people who are in the same shared space to document.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So I just want to point out one more thing that so Google has a lot of remote offices. So a lot of the insights that you've just shared with us and that are in your book are very relevant to, even though a lot of us are not working from home. I think a lot of people would agree that the relationship between Mountain View and New York and other remote offices sometimes reflects
Sure.
balance.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you have any thoughts about the issues of scale. I mean, I don't know what the headcount of WordPress was, but I assume it was probably like much smaller than a place like Google. But do you think that a model like that could scale up to many thousands?
Yeah,
of employees?
I think that it can. I think scale is an interesting question. This is one of the most common questions I've gotten so far. Just to give you the numbers. So when I was hired in 2010, I was employee number 58 or so. At the time that I left, which was 2012, the company was 110, and now they just crossed 200. As best I can tell, at 200, there's no signs of scale affecting any of this. And I don't think that it will. I think that you think of a product unit at any organization, software-wise or otherwise, a product unit's about 100 to 200 people. You also have Dunbar's number, which is like 250, which says, I think that number is probably a sweet spot. I could imagine if the company continues to grow, which it probably will, that there may end up being product units that are about 150 to 200 people, and there'd be multiple ones. And at those levels, in those units, it would work fine. The challenge would then become, do you have now executives? Like another level of hierarchy? The company's the culture's very resistant to hierarchy. What would those people do? They're not makers anymore. So now it's not just they had this very strong notion that leads were roles. It was not a profession to be a manager. A lead was a role. And you may be in that role for a while, but you should have some other skill set. Valve, the game company, is a similar notion. That you're hired because you're skilled in at least one thing. So I think that would be the challenge. The other challenge, the other way they get around this is, again, they do continuous deployment. So there's never this huge dependency tree. And that's what usually causes problems at scale. Is you have a group of 300 people that are waiting for this team of 20 to get something done, and that creates all these logistics and planning and need bureaucracy around that. And they avoid that because everything is almost always live. There's very rarely a huge pile of work that is waiting to be deployed.
So it's actually a two-part question. So the scale example, actually, I think a lot of people are thinking about. It's fine when you think of a small company, but what if WordPress starts releasing other products? Like, how does accounting, HR, how does it all work? And like the concept of hiring by trial is fine because of the field they're in. How would that work? Like, how did you interact with HR? What if you had an issue with something else? It's fine if you're working in development and you could do it offline and like sync up, but HR and things like that. And the second question I had is, how do you evaluate performance?
Okay. So the first question, I don't really know how to answer that. I mean, I think first and foremost, forget WordPress.com. Most things and most companies don't scale well. Like most companies fail. Most companies go out of business in a year. Some crazy statistic like that, right? Most companies don't scale well. You guys happen to work for one that has scaled really well. That's abnormal. That's unusual. So the same challenges that any organization has to grow and deal with growth and scale, those are big challenges for any company. It's not clear yet how remote work factors into that or not. That's really the best answer that I can give. From my experience working there, it seemed like because of how much emphasis is placed on employees, which I think it could be said about Google's culture as well, that diminishes the risks of scale. You have there's very little belief that adding another layer of management is going to solve any kind of problem. The second question about performance. This is a weird, a fascinating thing. I still haven't quite rationalized it in my head. There's a bunch of these questions that the book, as someone trying to be a manager, I was an outsider, and the book follows me trying to sort some of this stuff out. Some of it I still haven't completely sorted out how I feel about it. Very complicated, but the performance thing. So the performance thing, about 2 months into my tenure at the company, my team was actually together in the same place and the same physical location for the first time. And we talked about some stuff, and it went fine. And I had enough trust, I thought I could start asking some of these bigger questions. I asked my team, how do you know if you're doing a good job? And they all looked at each other and shrugged and went, I don't know. And I was like, okay. At the same time, that's a bizarre answer. I kind of expected it, that when you have an open source project, you inherit a whole bunch of values that are uncommon. A lot of the people who get hired at the company believe in this project, and they worked on it as a volunteer. It was something they did anyway. And now they're hired and get paid well to work on a project that they believe in anyway, a project they would help along even if it wasn't their job. So they're not motivated by getting a scorecard. They're not motivated by getting promoted. There's not even a lot of emphasis, really. There's some emphasis, but not a lot of emphasis, certainly much less in your typical company, on getting raises. People decide that they want to work here after the trial and all that stuff because they really like the work-life balance culture that it offers, that you can work anywhere you want. No one cares. No one cares about your hours. There's that much independence, and you're allowed to be good at what you do. So because people are so happy with that trade, and it's part of why they chose to work there, these are not, the performance and raises and bonuses, all that stuff does not come up much. Now, that may be something that changes 5 years from now when the company maybe isn't growing as much. There's not as much free reign about what you work on, but that remains to be seen. Anyway, I've never seen, so I worked at Microsoft for 9 years, as a decade as an author. I visit lots of companies. I go to lots of places, big companies, small companies. I've never seen a place where people were so happy with the total trade-offs of working there. These people they like what they do, and they love how they're treated, and they like the trade. Their lives are good, and they feel they get that good life because of the unusual choices that Matt Mullenweg and Tony Schneider at the company have made. That was at least my experience there. So their retention is really high for that reason. Some people may want more structure and may want they want a bigger house, and they think that's their focus for why they have a job. They probably wouldn't choose to go through the trial because they realize the culture isn't focused on those things. Yeah, sure. The mics are open.
So the follow-up would be, I think some of the things, there's a part about being happy, but then there's also a part about pushing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of times in your career, you get pushed into a stressful situation and you make it out of there, so you know you're a better person. But if I always wanted to be happy, I'd never force myself into
You're
that
right.
situation.
Happy is the wrong word. Fulfillment, I think, is a better word. But I should say, though, that because of these are open source cultural roots on an open source project, no one's ever really forcing you to do anything. It's a volunteer project. And there are certain pressures depending on what responsibilities you take on. But any open source project always has the flavor of volunteerism. And that's just rooted in how the company culture is set up. No one really ever, except in certain situations, that's not the fundamental driving force, is an executive saying, we must get this done by Friday, otherwise X or Y. Or it's not like a sports team where we must get 10 points tonight. It's just that Microsoft was more like that way. Most American companies have more of that spirit in them. This culture was not like that. And for better and for worse. I don't mean to offer it as idealized. I probably would have liked more of that, personally. That there was more of like a clear goal. We had we had this high pressure situation. I probably would have liked more of that. One of the challenges in the book was one project that we worked on was a project called Jetpack, which was actually it's a plugin for WordPress. It's an important plugin, but it had to be done by a certain date and time, which no other project that my team worked on had to do. So that was a challenge to figure out how does this company and this team that had never worked on a structured project or worked on a release cycle, how can we figure out how to do that? So there's 2 chapters in the book that are all about me trying to figure out how to put into place some kind of structure and process for making that happen. Yeah. Last call for questions. Anybody else? One more question.
So this is maybe a quick follow-up on that. It's open source, but I don't know the exact business model, but at some point you're allowing people to host their blogs with WordPress.com, and you have these IRC servers, and so you have some amount of cost.
Yes.
So you need to make some amount of money to pay for those things. So at somewhere there's a motivator to say this isn't all just volunteerism. It's
Sure.
hey, get things done.
Yes.
Right? Maybe you could talk a little
Sure,
about
absolutely.
that.
So that was one of the big questions I had going to the company. And there's a chapter in the book that talks all about their business model and how they're thinking about that in the future. That the simple answer is that WordPress is an open source project that started in 2003. WordPress.com and the company Automatic was formed in 2005. And the primary ambition was to solve this hosting issue. That WordPress is free software, you still have to put it somewhere. But there's also it's a corporation. Their ambition is to make money and to support WordPress, but to make money. WordPress.com makes money 3 ways. One is through advertising, very small amount of advertising. How much that will change as the company's ambitions, who knows? But right now it's tiny. But because of how much traffic they get, it's a substantial revenue stream for a company of 200 people. Second is upgrades. It's a freemium model. So if you want more storage space, you want a better theme, you want more control over CSS, you pay a subscription for those things. That's their most substantial and probably the most growth is probably with upgrades and services around that. The third is VIP hosting. So there are some premier media companies and corporations that host their blogs and in some cases their entire websites on WordPress.com's architecture. And they pay a premium for that. It's not a consumer-oriented service, and WordPress.com gets revenue from that. So those are the 3 revenue streams: ads, upgrades, and VIP hosting. And the book does talk about this. I had this, having worked at most corporations, there was a surprisingly small amount of pressure on revenue ambitions in terms of feature direction. That most of the emphasis was on growth, not surprising for a young company, but they're not young anymore, and on activity. So one of my team's jobs was trying to do user experience design work to increase user engagement. How often people posted, how often people commented. That was one of my team's charters. The one other thing I should say that's been fascinating is many of these trade-offs that they have made about giving employees so much independence and these revenue choices is a very long-term vision for what WordPress and WordPress.com should be. And I found that inspiring. That it's very easy to talk about our long-term vision and then where's our quarterly earnings? Where's our quarterly earnings? And most of the decisions that Matt and Tony made were, even if I didn't agree with them, which in some cases I didn't, but I understood why they felt that was in the best long-term interest of the company and the WordPress project itself.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Well, I hope you guys check out the book, and thanks for listening. Thanks. Yeah.